Today we're going to focus on Chapter 2, Modules 2.10 to 2.16. So these modules focus specifically on the properties of water and the pH scale. So this lecture is going to be much shorter than the first part of Chapter 2, but don't confuse the brevity of the material with the importance. So this material is very important, so make sure you pay attention to this short lecture. So water is actually probably one of the most important molecules in all of life. So that's one of the reasons why I'm taking a whole entire lecture video just to explain its characteristics and properties. So the main reason why water is such an important molecule is because life first started in water. And because of this, all the chemical and biochemical reactions evolved to take place in water. So if we switched out water for a different liquid molecule, those chemical reactions wouldn't take place at all. And all cells today, so modern cells, all contain some amount of water. So you'll learn about cytoplasm in the next chapter. So cytoplasm is made of cytosol, and cytosol is mainly water. So again, for the reactions to occur inside the cell requires water. And thinking about human biology, humans are about 60% water. So again, being a living organism, our ancestors, billions of years ago, first originated in water. So just like them, we require water for our chemical and biochemical reactions to occur. So we've talked about some of the reasons why water is such an important molecule in life. But now let's talk about the chemistry behind water that makes it so important. So here we have a molecule of water. So the chemical formula for water is H2O. So you can see the one oxygen atom in red and the two hydrogen atoms in white. So water is a polar covalent molecule. So there's unequal sharing of electrons. So you have to go back to this idea of electronegativity. So essentially a fancy way of saying that some elements want electrons more than others. So you can see that the oxygen is pulling away electrons from the hydrogen and is keeping those electrons for itself. So again, the fact that oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen makes a polar covalent bond. So an unequal sharing of electrons. Because of this unequal sharing, this makes hydrogen slightly positive. So remember, this lowercase delta means slightly. So the hydrogen atoms in H2O are slightly positive, and the single oxygen atom is slightly negative. So those negative electrons are hanging around oxygen, which makes oxygen slightly negative, and those electrons are being pulled away from hydrogen, which makes hydrogen slightly positive. So by itself, this doesn't really mean a whole bunch, but when we add more water molecules to this picture, we're going to see how these slightly positive and slightly negative charges come into play. So here we have 5 water molecules in arrangement. So remember the chemical formula of water is H2O. So we have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen per molecule of water. So here's that 1 oxygen, 2 hydrogen. Same thing with this water molecule over here. The oxygen is going to be in red, and the 2 hydrogen are going to be in white. Again, going back to last lecture, we have these lines right here, which indicate a covalent bond. So also remember, water is polar covalent. So the oxygen wants electrons more than the hydrogen, and that creates dipole moment, which gives hydrogens slightly positive charges and oxygen a slightly negative charge. So we have to go back from a concept, or to a concept from the last lecture, and that's opposites attract. So you can imagine the slightly positive charges of the hydrogen would be attracted to slightly negative charges. Same thing with the slightly negative charge of oxygen, that would be attracted to something positive. And that's exactly what we see happening between these molecules of water. So here we have a slightly negative oxygen molecule, oxygen atom, interacting with a slightly positive charge of a hydrogen on a different molecule of water. Same thing with this water molecule right here. We have a hydrogen that's slightly positive, and it's interacting with the slightly negative charge of the oxygen on a different water molecule. We can also see the same thing with hydrogens. So here we have a slightly positive charge on a hydrogen atom, and that's interacting with a slightly negative charge of an oxygen on a different water molecule. So these are called hydrogen bonds. I'll write this again down here since it's a very important word. So here we have a type of bond between water molecules. So whereas something like a polar covalent bond happens within a single molecule, hydrogen bonds happen between molecules, so between different molecules. So to drive this point home, I have a small question for you to answer. So what type of bond is intermolecular in water? So intermolecular is a fancy way of saying between molecules. So now that you've taken some time to answer that question, let's move on to a second one. So we'll come back to the answer to question 1 after you complete this next question. So tell me what type of bond is intramolecular in water. So intramolecular means within a molecule. So essentially within one molecule of water, what type of bond is present? So let's go back to question number 1. So this is looking at intermolecular bonds between water molecules. So the key word here is intermolecular. So these bonds occur between water molecules. So if I draw some water molecules really quick. So again, we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen per water molecule. The type of bond that occurs between these 2 are hydrogen bonds. So those are bonds that are represented by little dots. So because of the slightly positive charge on a hydrogen and a slightly negative charge on oxygen, you have hydrogen bonds interacting between water molecules. So that is between different water molecules. So the correct answer here is C, hydrogen bonds. And question 2 is just the exact opposite of that question. So here we're looking at bonds within a molecule of water. So this is within a single molecule of water. And those are represented by these complete lines right here. These are polar covalent bonds. So they're covalent because it's all about sharing electrons, and because there's unequal sharing, that makes them polar covalent bonds. So while A was an okay answer, the best answer was B, polar covalent bonds. So hydrogen bonds are really the reason why water is such a unique molecule. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about some characteristics of water that are due to the hydrogen bonding between the water molecules. So the first characteristic we're going to talk about is the fact that ice floats. So this is a very unique characteristic to water. It's not something you normally see in other liquids and solids. So on the left-hand side of this picture, we have water. And on the right-hand side, we have benzene. So water, again, has hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, but benzene does not. So benzene lacks hydrogen bonds. So because of those hydrogen bonds in water, ice floats. And due to the lack of hydrogen bonds in benzene, the solid benzene sinks to the bottom. So in the next slide, we're going to see how those hydrogen bonds actually come into play and why they give water this unique characteristic where the solid form actually floats. So here is a diagram or picture from your textbook, and it shows both the liquid and solid forms of water. So in liquid water, you have hydrogen bonds that are constantly breaking and reforming. So you can see that these water molecules are very compact. So if you look at the empty space in between the water molecules, you can see there's not a whole lot of empty space. However, when you form ice, these hydrogen bonds become very, very stable. And you have this hexagon formed. So as you can see, there's a lot more empty space in between these water molecules compared to the liquid form. So this actually makes ice less dense than liquid water. So essentially less compact than liquid water. And because of that, ice floats to the top of liquid water, and this creates these ice sheets that you can find polar bears sleeping on. So essentially the hydrogen bonds become more rigid, and this creates these hexagons that make ice less dense than liquid water. So here's another question for you. So imagine, what if ice didn't float? So what would happen, essentially, if ice didn't float on a lake? So explain to me some consequences of this. So there isn't really a correct answer here, but one of the things I came up with is the fact that if water didn't float, then that would crush everything underneath the ice. So essentially every winter, once the water starts freezing, you're going to have sheets of ice falling to the ground and killing everything. So it's very convenient that ice floats, because if it didn't, then it would kill all the animals and plants living underneath the water. You can probably also think of this polar bear in the last slide. So if there were ice sheets around and that ice was falling to the bottom of the ocean, there wouldn't be anywhere for this polar bear to sit. So it's very, very important that ice floats. And again, the fact that ice floats is due to hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds also play a very important role in two phenomena: cohesion and adhesion. These words sound very similar, but be careful. We're going to talk about the difference between cohesion and adhesion in this slide and the next couple of slides. So the example we're going to use here is that of a tree. So as you all probably know, there's lots and lots of water in the soil, but the tree needs some way of bringing that water up from the roots all the way to the leaves. And water is a very important molecule in performing photosynthesis, which occurs in the leaves. So water is moved in part by these water conducting cells. We're not going to talk a whole lot about them now, but later in the semester these are going to be very important cells. So really the meat of this picture is the right hand diagram right here, showing adhesion and cohesion water molecules. So cohesion is essentially hydrogen bonding between water molecules, and adhesion is water molecules binding to something else other than water. In this case, we have water binding to the water conducting cells, and that's pulling the water up to the top of the tree. So by using both cohesion and adhesion, the tree is able to conduct water up from the roots all the way to the leaves. In this next slide, I have a little bit more of a cutesy picture of what cohesion and adhesion are. So you can think of cohesion being hydrogen bonding between molecules of water, and adhesion being between water and something else. In this case, between water molecules and plant cells. So this is cohesion-adhesion. You can also think of cohesion and adhesion playing a role in the fact that water creates droplets. So we have cohesion within the droplet between the water molecules, and we have adhesion between the droplet and the surface that it's on top of. So this shows both cohesion and adhesion, cohesion again being between water molecules, and adhesion being between water molecules and something else. Next up, we have another characteristic of water, and that's the fact that it's very good at dissolving chemicals. And again, this is due to the hydrogen bonds in water. So in this example, we're going to use sodium chloride, or NaCl. This is table salt. So sodium chloride is made up of ionic bonds. So there's a positive sodium ion and a negative chlorine ion. So just as before, opposites attract. So we're actually going to have bonding between the positive sodium ion and the slightly negative oxygen. Same thing with the chlorine, just reversed. We have this negative chlorine interacting with the positive or slightly positive charges of the hydrogen. So because of this, water is actually able to pull apart the sodium chloride into its ion constituents. So it's able to pull apart NaCl into Na+ and Cl-. So through these means, water is able to dissolve a salt. And here it says just that. So the salt NaCl dissociates in water. And dissociates is essentially another way of saying dissolves. So this is one example of how water is able to dissolve certain chemicals. So the last characteristic water we're going to talk about is evaporative cooling. So just as you all know, if you're sweating or you just got out of the shower, you're very, very cold. And that's because the water is evaporating off of your skin. As it does that, it's breaking hydrogen bonds in between the water molecules, and it's sapping heat essentially away from your skin. So it's using the heat from your skin to break those hydrogen bonds and evaporate. And that causes evaporative cooling. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is the pH scale. So all of you are probably somewhat familiar with this, but we're going to go over it again. So the pH scale essentially tells you how acidic or basic something is. So at the top of this picture we have 0, so that's the most acidic pH we have. And this goes all the way up to 14, which is the most basic. Sometimes you'll also see alkaline as well. So basic and alkaline are interchangeable. So something like battery acid, so like battery acid you find in your car, that has a very low pH, so around 1 or 0. You can go up the scale, so something like tomato juice is fairly acidic. Something like water is neutral. You can go further up. So household ammonia has a pH between 11 and 12. An oven cleaner is almost a pH of 14. So you can see the pHs of various acidic, basic, and neutral substances on this scale. And again, acidic things are closer to 0, basic things are closer to 14, and neutral substances are 7. So the pH scale essentially measures the concentration of hydrogen ions. So that's the main thing that's measured here. So for something like this acidic solution, it has a much greater concentration of hydrogen ions. Something like a neutral solution, if you count, there are 5 hydrogen ions and 5 of these OH ions, or hydroxyl ions. So when you have an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions, we call this a neutral solution. As we go up to a more basic solution, you can see the number of hydrogen ions decreases in comparison to the number of hydroxyl ions you have. So in a basic solution, you have a greater number of OH ions compared to hydrogen ions. In a neutral solution, you have an equal number of hydrogen ions compared to OH ions. And in an acidic solution, you have a greater number of hydrogen ions compared to OH ions. But essentially the pH scale, again, is measuring how many hydrogen ions you have. And in that regard, the pH scale is essentially backwards. If you're curious about this, you can come see me after class and we can talk about the math of how the pH scale is actually determined. But essentially the way the math works out, everything is flipped. So the lower the hydrogen ion concentration, the higher the number is on the scale. So acidic things, again, are closer to 0, even though they have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. And substances with low hydrogen ion concentrations are actually a higher number. So it's inverted. So that concludes this lecture. So I hope you learned lots about water and also a little bit about the pH scale. So again, all of these concepts are very, very important as we go into the biochemistry in the next chapter.